Wire are an incredibly interesting band, obviously. I've made my admiration for them, I think, quite clear with the Chairs Missing and with the 154 uploads. Although, my other favourite Wire album, hell, my second favourite Wire album behind 154 is this one, 1988's A Bell is a Cup Until Is Struck. What we have here, it's somewhat, it seems like, based upon comments on radio music, something of a divisive, potentially, album within the Wire discography. Wire do not have it listed on their own website for sale with details. This is quite interesting. I'm under the impression that maybe the group has disowned this album to some extent. Considering Wire's direction in the 1990s was the complete opposite of this album, Wire embracing the industrial kind of, that these trends in 1990s popular music, which maybe it's the 90s is just not my favorite decade of Wire. I'm just not the biggest fan of that era of industrial music personally. I prefer the EDM era of the 80s, and as far as my industrial music goes personally. Anyway, that's kind of I was gonna say that's kind of irrelevant, but not entirely. We are talking about Wire. Wire in the 21st century, I think, have put out more interesting albums overall than they have in the 1990s, and even at times they return to the sounds of 1988's A Bell is a Cup Till It Is Struck, namely on Object 47, which is possibly my favourite of the Wire 21st century albums, and that's also an incredibly divisive record amongst the fan base. Here's the thing, I really love Wire are some of the best pop songwriters of all time, apparently. Pop music fans are never going to give it the time of day. Wire fans aren't going to be very inclined to embrace too much pop music, I imagine, or at least the idea of Wire doing so just seems a bit. It's like I don't listen to Wire for that. I listen to Talk for that, or whoever you want to name, Talking Heads. But the thing is, it doesn't matter. Like, I don't know. I feel like Wire's experiments on here, songs like Kidney Bingos, the Queen of and the King of the Finest Drops. I mean, Follow the Locust. Some of these are a bit more abrasive than others, perhaps. But my goodness, like, this is one of the most. Sometimes the songwriting and the precision on here, it brings tears to my eyes. Who knew that? And it's the catchiness of certain songs, but it's also lying back in a beanbag and just kind of realizing every little thing that's coming together to accentuate those songs, things that are playing against each other, production touches. These tracks were slaved over. These guys had the post-punk bands would go into a phase where they decided that, we're making this gloomy kind of music, but for some of it's experimental, but sometimes it's really catchy as well. They had a certain sweet tooth for pop. We saw what happened with the music of. Who knows if they would have gone in this direction anyway if Ian Curtis had lived, although where New Order went, where Gang of Four went, and they were kind of crap at it, frankly, where The Cure went. This is a common place for these groups to go in the more anthemic or pop territory. Simple Minds, obviously, and Wire were the one group whose fan base would probably have none of that. There was. Even on the experiments on 154 in this territory, 154 is probably the more contentious of the three amongst the fan base. Actually, amongst the hardcore fans, Pink Flag is the one they don't like as much, just because it's the least. In a way, it's the least experimental of the Wire albums. Although in the context of 1977, anything first wave punk was a little bit experimental. To be fair, it just in the long run, it stands out as the most normal of the Wire albums, perhaps, except for maybe some of the genius pop on Object 47, the great, I'll make another video on Object 47 later, but that kind of utopian, unoriginal, but beautifully pastiche guitar pop of the 2000s. Wire also made the best album of that sort in the 2000s. In 2008? Yeah, Object 47, so 2008 to 2007, and the 80s album, 88 album, A Bell is a Cup Until It Is Struck, that is the equivalent. It's I can't believe this is the peak of poppy post-punk, perhaps. This was Wire's fifth studio album. They'd gone on a bit of a hiatus after 154, and they reconvened in 1987. Well, they reconvened earlier, but the fourth studio album was 1987's The Ideal Copy, which that presages the industrial experiments of the 90s, I feel, a little bit. That's close to their 90s work. And then A Bell as a Cup kind of reminds one of the traditional post-punk sound from Chairs Missing or 154, but in a more in a direction that's more about traditional kind of songwriting, or at least within that kind of bass heavy, rhythm heavy post punk context. You know, you can imagine A Bell as a Cup Until It Is Struck as the debut album of like a really interesting and inventive within that certain formula post punk group from like 82, 83, except this is 88. And maybe in the context of 1988, why I felt like they were selling out by trying to pander to a pop music styling that they didn't realize was kind of out of fashion. You know, like kind of jangle was kind of all the rage in the indie world at that time, I believe, in the UK. Correct me if I'm mistaken. If I'm making any assumptions or if anything, any take here is inaccurate, please do let me know in the comments. Nothing I say is necessarily gospel, obviously. Although, nevertheless, like why put out this genius album within that formula, and I think you started having certain fans who weren't even hardcore Wire fans, who were kind of more casual Wire fans, people who enjoyed the first three albums, kind of going to the fifth album, you know, because, you know, it's 1, 2, 3, what's next? 4, 5, and really liking 5, and you're just like, this album's great. It's a very easy album to get into, and unless you're hung up on certain orthodox principles and rules, and there are certain prerogatives or parameters which you feel as though Wire ought not to, or music in 1988 onward ought not to follow, then I suppose it can be easy to dismiss A Bell as a Cup Until It Is Struck. But if you're just happy to enjoy beautifully formed and composed guitar pop songwriting especially kind of for the post-punk scene, and it doesn't matter what year it came from, it still has the production touches of something that could have come from 82, 83. It's not like something with 21st century production that's trying to pretend it's still 1988 or something, or 1982 rather. It's easy to appreciate A Bell as a Cup Until It Is Struck, I think, you imagine it as a group not called Wire. In fact, you don't even know what this group is called. You're just enjoying these tracks that you hear in the Eva. And God, aren't they beautifully composed? Aren't they so well constructed? And aren't they fucking catchy? Absolutely.